Okay, so now we're getting into even larger scales, looking at a specific area and the many different species and ecosystems within this area, and they can have kind of a variety. Generally, a landscape covers, like as you can see here, a mountainside or a field. May include waterways and other things as well. So we'll get into then the different parts of landscape ecology. So this is the study of landscape structure. So how and the processes which help form those structures within the landscape. Landscapes, like I said, are generally heterogeneous. They have different composition of species, different soil types, different gradations from one to another as you go from one area to another. And the landscape elements are visually distinctive in an ecosystem. So sometimes we can see this in these vegetation maps or ecosystem maps, which kind of show the different types of dominant vegetation or types of ecosystem within an area. So Bowen and Burgess published quantitative analysis of several Ohio landscapes, and they quantified the patch shape by ratio of perimeter to the perimeter of a circle with an area equal to that of the patch. So mathematically it looks like this, where S is our patch shape, and an increasing value means it's less circular, meaning it has more perimeter than it has area. So a patch that is very long, and thin would have a very large perimeter compared to its area, so it would have a large S value. But if it's very round, which is the ideal shape of a patch, many natural states are going to be these round patches, but they can naturally be the other as well. Anyway, so if it's very round, that means the perimeter is less compared to the area. It has more area than perimeter. So that's just one way to look at patches or different, it's a heterogeneous landscape, so the different vegetation types or ecosystems within the landscape. So ecotones are an example of part of this heterogeneous landscape. And ecotones are the areas in between two different ecosystems. So here we have a land ecosystem, a terrestrial ecosystem, an aquatic ecosystem. The transitional ecosystem here would be the marshland, the ecotone between the two. They can be physical, like this marshland, or they can just be a mix between the two. So if you have, like, say, grassland and forest, maybe you have shrubs in between. Now there is an effect of the edge or the area in between the two. And they generally have higher species richness in these ecotones than both of the other types, and that's because you kind of have a mix of both inputs, right? You have terrestrial and aquatic input, so you get quite a diversity of organisms in that ecotone and those edges. Species associated with ecotone are edge species, and those not found in ecotones are not. Alright, so when you take the geometry and split it up into different pieces, perimeter estimates a complex shape depending on the size of the measuring device. So how the scale you use depends on what you'll find as well. So smaller features may only show up with smaller measuring devices. So if you're looking at a large scale in a landscape and you're using just large measuring devices, then you're going to miss a lot of the small features as well. So an example of this at Admiralty Island, if you looked at a 10-kilometer ruler, you would estimate there's only 400 kilometers of shoreline, but in actuality there is 800 kilometers because of the individual, more precise areas that are less than 10 kilometers. So within a landscape, then, if you're looking at these smaller and smaller scales, and you're looking at smaller and smaller differences, you're going to notice that the structure is going to be different throughout the landscape. And that structure influences processes such as how energy goes from one trophic level to another, the materials within it, and the species between the ecosystems. So these are all affected by the structure and the processes within them. So ecologists have looked at the structure and how it influences species and organisms by providing potential habitats for those species. So a metapopulation then is kind of like a patch of species. So species will, have suitable habitat only in these patches, and the population then will live within that patch. And they may go from one metapopulation to another and exchange. So here you have all these different metapopulations of different sizes, and populations can go between them. The rate of movement between these metapopulations can affect species persistence in the landscape. So an example is with mammals. Diffendorfer et al. Studied how patch size affects the movement of 3 different mammal species. And the prediction was that animals would move farther in more fragmented landscapes because they have to move around to get to the resources they need. And it also predicted animals would stay longer in more isolated patches. What they found, though, was that a larger patch size, they actually decreased their average movement. Okay, so it kind of goes with this. If they have smaller fragmented landscapes, then they're going to move more. And then also the proportion of individuals that moved increased as patch size increased. So a larger proportion of them moved around. So patch size affects the movements of small mammals. So corridors are these kind of areas which connect different patches, which make it easier to go from one to the other. So you may have a forest here and a forest here and a forest here, and have some sort of forest corridor that connects them to allow the movement of animals. And this seems to help. It's actually better just to have one large patch for the most part, but this will at least help animals in their dispersal between patches. Haddon and Baum found corridors influenced the movement of butterflies. So butterflies in different patches, corridors help them connect and go to different areas. Webster explored how lake position and landscape affected chemical responses to drought. Essentially, these upper lakes, if they were higher in elevation and you had a drought, these reduced much more significantly in water level than the ones at the lower areas. All right, so landscape structure is dependent on what is the parent material or the original substrate used to make the soil. And new substrate is formed by processes such as volcanism, sedimentation, so where you have kind of the depositing of substrate by water events, and erosion. These are the primary sources of landscape structure. McAuliffe showed Bahatus, that's this ecosystem in the Sonoran Desert, are a complex mosaic of distinctive landforms, so a lot of different things actually within this landscape, and it found a wide range of soil types and plant distributions according to how old the soil was. And the soil structure then, how old the soil was, determined what type of species of plants inhabited there. And you can see those on a map clearly show the different types of species of plants with the different types of soils. So this is kind of what he looked at. He saw that very new soils didn't have a B horizon, had less diversity of soil types, and as you get older and older, you see a lot more layers and more rich layers in the different types of soil. All right, McAleef also looked at soil mosaics, which consisted of patches of material deposited during floods originated in nearby mountains. So here you have, a flood which creates this sedimentation. This is called alluvial soil. So material eroded from the mountain slopes deposited as alluvium on surrounding Bajadas, that ecosystem we showed you. And the climate affected these alluvial deposits. So as the climate changed, these deposits changed as well, which created different soils and different plant types. All right, so then looking at organisms, many studies have focused on the conversion of forests to agricultural landscapes. And in eastern North America, we can also do the opposite, where you can look at some abandoned farms and how they then convert back to forests. So here's just a graph showing, this is the original forest cover in 1831. You can see it's become more and more fragmented to now where there's hardly any forest left because all this white area has become agricultural lands. There are species then that affect the landscape, and we talked about a couple of these. The beaver, how they are an ecosystem engineer. Elephants do a similar thing in their ecosystem. They knock down trees, so they prevent these late successional competitive species from establishing in an area and keep the woodland, convert the woodland essentially to a grassland, which they can eat easier. Kangaroo rats and other burrowing species also will create burrows, which will create a heterogeneous landscape for other animals to live in and plants to grow in. Beavers, like we said, cut down trees, create ponds and other things. Now, one time, all of North America, all the streams and rivers and everything were affected by beavers, but when we create an agricultural landscape, humans will remove the beavers so they can have access to that water easier. All right, beaver activity between 1927 and 1988 increased, so we're allowing beavers to come back because it helps a lot of things. Impounded areas trap materials, rising waters capture nutrients, and habitats created by beavers promote nutrient retention and biochemical processes. So all these, beavers are very important to the natural landscape and help a lot of other species. All right, so we mentioned fire with succession. Fire is an important part of many ecosystems. So Minnick used satellite photos comparing Southern California to Northern Baja. Southern California, very populated, very fire suppressed. Northern Baja, not so much. So the landscape looked at a patchwork of old and new burns, and they have similar climates, but again, fire suppressed in Southern California, but not in Baja. And and you saw a much healthier ecosystem where fires were allowed to naturally burn than in Southern California, where it was all the fire regime was all messed up because of the suppression of fires.